Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode in the Halo implementation series. Today with me, again, I have my favorite person from Halo, Mr. Halo himself, Morgan Aspinall. And today we are going to be talking about SLAs. So, hey Morgan, how you doing? And thanks for being with me again.
Hey Chris, yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, hopefully that Mr. Halo name sticks at some point.
I'm sure it will. You know, of all the people I've spoken to at Halo, which is pretty much you,
Yeah,
you are Mr. Halo in my eyes. So you know, and I really appreciate everything you've done to kind of help me, and you know, everything you're doing to help MSPs to kind of get this product set up. So I'm very interested in you know, talking more about SLAs and
yeah,
also you know, from the customer's point of view, you know, or I guess Halo customers' point of view, is how do they set up SLAs? What do they mean? When do they use them? All that kind of stuff. So
yeah,
over to
absolutely.
you.
Awesome. All right, let me just share my screen. Can you see that?
Certainly can, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Yeah, like you say, SLAs are sort of a core metric that and most, if not all, MSPs are going to want to be tracking. And we'll take a look at sort of how you create a particular SLA, how we can create multiple SLAs, some of the core features around SLA functionality in HaloPSA. So as with most of the changes that are made in the system, we're going to firstly want to head to our configuration module. And within here, we have our service level agreements option. So the first place that we'll go in here is we'll go to the general settings, and I'll just highlight some of the core features within the general settings. So SLAs in Halo track two core metrics. They track an initial response time and a resolution time. And we'll talk more about what those refer to in a moment. But yeah, we start with we have those two that you can track, and the first two options at the top are: do you actually want to track both of those, or potentially you're only concerned with the fixed by date, at which point you could disable your response target altogether. Below that as well, we also have this feature that I like to mention during implementations, that's our SLA hold reminders. So we can have emails sent out on a scheduled basis to the customers when a ticket is awaiting their response. And then if no response is provided within a given date range, we can actually have the ticket closed off. So I quite like this feature as a means of keeping the ticket moving forward, right? You don't just have a ticket in a dormant state where potentially the issue has been resolved, but once it's been resolved, the customer just never applies again, and the ticket never actually gets closed. So if you enable this option, you'll find two fields presented below where you can specify a number of hours between reminder emails, so the frequency of those chaser emails that are automatically sent, and then a number of hours between which the ticket going on hold where no response is given and the ticket being closed off. And you might be thinking at this point, okay, so we set a number of hours, but I don't necessarily want my incident to be closed off at midnight on a Saturday. I actually only want my reminder emails and closures to be sent during my working business hours. Now you can enable that by enabling the use workday hours option just below. So at that point, we'll be inheriting the workdays that are configured in Halo, which leads me nicely onto the next point within our SLAs. So we take a step back, and instead of going into general settings, I can actually go into workdays. And these are going to be how you specify the hours during which your SLA timer is ticking down. Again, if your sort of standard working hours are 9 to 5, and someone logs a ticket at 7 p.m., you're not going to want that SLA timer to be ticking down until 9 a.m. the next day. So you can come into your workdays and you can configure them to either use the same time each day, at which point you specify a start and end time, and of course the days that are applicable. Or if you have a work week that sort of has the hours broken up, so potentially you have I don't know, 8 to 4 Monday to Tuesday, 9 to 5 Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. At that point, you can actually pick the start and end times each day by unchecking this.
I'd love to work at that company that you work at that does 8 to 4 Monday and Tuesday, and then
Be the dream, eh?
yeah, living the dream, right?
I suppose that a functional example, a more sort of practical example of this could be if you have different teams in your MSP that work different shifts in order for you to provide service over a sort of a larger time frame. You might want to specify different SLAs and have different work hours applicable to the different times that you're actually working. So
Makes sense.
Part of that as well, of course, is going to be your holidays. So we have a holidays tab at the top where you can put your sort of public holidays in, at which point the SLA timer is not going to be ticking down as well. You know, for the unfortunate individuals that are working Christmas Day, you know, I mean, this is off, but for those unfortunate individuals that are working Christmas Day, at least they can be rest assured that they're not sort of having an SLA time tracked against their responses.
Yeah. So just to ask in terms of and actually this is something that would be useful for me to know in there as well, is I've always set those manually every year. Is that something that you have to do, or is that something that can be, you know, every year does it automatically kind of detect what those holidays should be and set them?
At the minute it's manual, but we are working on having those imported automatically and updated each year according to region and whatnot.
Sure. Yeah, because I think that's one of the things in you know, every PSA tool I've ever worked with that is the same. It's always manual, and I think it's one of the things people always forget to do, because you know, you get to a point where it's, you know, you suddenly got to the end of the year and then you forget to go put the holidays in for the following year, and then you know, your SLAs trigger at all kinds of weird times because it doesn't recognize those as holidays. So so that would be good to kind of have that whole side automated based on whatever country you're in and things like that. So
yeah, for sure. It's going to definitely save a lot of time once we have the ability to, at a minimum, import from some JSON file or some CSV.
I mean, even if it's, you know, even if it's a manual thing that somebody has to set up, them like, you know, like an integration that you set up yourself, rather than you know, then they can choose to integrate with whatever holiday system they want to integrate with somewhere. But no, that would actually be really cool. So
for sure. Yeah, cool. And then the final option in here and sort of tying everything together is to actually create the SLAs. So I've mentioned that you can track an initial response and resolution time, and the SLA time will be ticking down based on particular work days. But how do we actually create our SLAs themselves, and how do we establish the target response and resolution hours per priority / SLA? We do that within the service level agreements option within config service level agreements. And so you can create multiple SLAs in here. Each SLA is going to be composed of a series of priorities, where one is the highest priority. Going down, you can have as many of these priorities as you wish, just based on the level that you have here. And when you're setting your priorities up, you can give it a level, again, sort of one being the highest and working down that way. We give our priorities a description and a priority color that establishes the SLA window that we saw on our ticket details in our previous session. Below that as well, we can override our workday hours. So this is quite a nice feature. So you might have your standard incident SLA that ticks down during business hours, but then a P1 is 24/7. So if P1 comes in, you know, any time of the day, that needs to get resolved. So you can override your workday hours per priority within an SLA.
Okay, that's good.
And then below that, we have our response target time and response resolution time in hours or days, based on what we pick on the right-hand side here.
Okay,
cool. So we've got our SLAs and our based on our priorities, and we've got our work days and all of that stuff. The last point that I just want to mention is, how do we actually apply these SLAs to a particular site in Halo, or a particular ticket type? And so what we can do once we've got our SLAs set up is we might want to head to configuration, tickets, ticket types, and we might want to say that a particular ticket type is using a particular SLA. And we could do that from our ticket type configuration within the defaults tab, just down here under our default service level agreement, where we can also set our default priority as well. So you might have a medium priority and everything comes in as medium initially and could be overridden potentially at the point of triaging, or based on some other functionality such as ticket rules that we'll mention in another session. And then the other place that you might want to consider when sort of changing your SLAs is going to be within a site. So you can also set a service level agreement at site level.
Okay.
And yeah, I think that's SLAs in a nutshell. Couple of other points that we'll discuss in another session, namely around those automated emails. What do those automated emails look like? And that's based on some particular email templates. Just to briefly mention that.
Can you go through, just while we're talking about SLAs, maybe talk about, you were talking about sort of setting up P1s, P2s, but how do those relate to kind of tickets, right? So at what point in the ticket does that, when its status is new and then I've changed the status, how do I determine at what point that hits what SLA?
So I mean, initially, so yeah, let's just talk through sort of a ticket lifecycle real quick and actually have a look at the SLAs. And probably another important point to mention is when do those timers actually tick down? So
yeah,
first things first, we have our ticket type with a default SLA and default priority. Now what that means is when I go to log a new incident, well, firstly, we have our priority coming in here based on our default priority. We'll just leave this as it is. And we'll see here again, we'll take a look at what's happening here in another session, but effectively a ticket rule based on the impact and urgency selected has defined our priority. But for now, we won't worry about that too much. And we'll see that up top, we've got our service level agreement section with our target response and resolution times and our timer ticking down in accordance with the SLA, default SLA, and priority combination. In terms of establishing a first response, that's based on an action in Halo that is configured to respond to the SLA. So if we were to go to config tickets actions and we were to take a look at private note, for example, I can't type. Oh, there we go. We have down here in the details tab for our action, response behavior. Now, of course, a private note, we don't want to mark that as an SLA response. However, something like email user, we would want that to mark as an SLA response. And in practice, what that means is in our ticket that is still ticking down and doesn't yet have a response target, a response marked against it, if I were to write a private note, then we're still ticking down against our initial response target. However, if I was to click email user, we'll see that now our response has been logged, and that's based on that response behavior at action level. And then there's that leads us on to the next point of how do we actually establish when our SLA timer is ticking down. So That's close enough. Yeah, so we've sent our email, we've marked our response. We can actually see now below our resolution target, we've got this on hold. So we can now see that the SLA timer is not going to be ticking down. And that's all driven by the status of our ticket. And so how we can actually determine what status is in Halo, what ticket status is in Halo, pause or resume the SLA timer. We can do that by going to configuration, tickets, statuses. And for each status, we have this SLA hold action. So of course, the with user status is going to pause our SLA timer, and that's what we just saw on the ticket. And while I'm here as well, it's definitely worth mentioning this checkbox below, this option below, where we can establish whether or not SLA hold reminders are actually sent when a ticket is on this status. So a good example of this is the with user status, kind of assuming that we're awaiting customer response here. We're waiting for some feedback back from the end user in question. So at this point, we will want to be sending those hold reminders. We require more information. We don't want that. We don't want that email to not get back to us. And if it doesn't get back to us, then we'll close the ticket off. However, a status such as scheduled, for example, you might have a site visit scheduled for a month, or you might have some non-urgent issue that we're going to follow up with the customer next week on. At that point, we want to pause our SLA timer because we don't want to skew our metrics. There's nothing else that the MSP can do at this point. But at the same time, we don't want to send those reminders to the customer because there's not actually any more information required from the customer. So we could have a status in here that might be, scheduled, and that's going to pause our timer, but it's not going to send hold reminders. And then again, within our statuses, we can also specify that we want to remove the ticket from hold. So tying this back to our ticket type configuration, we can see it again for our incident ticket type. When the end user sends an update on that ticket, either via the self-service portal or via an inbound email, that's going to change the status of the ticket to updated. And then based on our SLA hold action for the status, we're going to be resuming our timer. So you've got your email user action that changes the status to with user and pauses the timer. And then you've got your ticket type configuration such that the response back from the user changes the status to updated and kicks off that timer again.
Okay. All right, that makes sense. Yeah. So that's a kind of really good way that you can kind of customize this and drive this from statuses and from actions and things like that. So it makes a lot of sense.
It's I imagine that initially it can be quite an overwhelming concept. It certainly was for me when I was first learning Halo. But when you start to see it as sort of monkey chaining one bit of config to the next, you can break it down quite nicely like that. So we've got our SLA and we've got the timer ticking down. Well, how do we pause or resume the timer? Well, that's based on the status. Okay, so how do we manipulate the status? That's based on an action. And hopefully you can start to see how the different modules at this point would be tying together to provide an overall effective experience for the MSP and for the customer.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense. Makes perfect sense. So I, and I think, as you say, and again, a lot of these things in terms of how this works and how things go on hold and come off hold and, the various SLA statuses, I think are pretty similar to the way that any other PSA tool does this. And then also, so anyone who's been using any other kind of PSA tool and using the SLAs, this would be fairly, fairly familiar to them. Because pretty much this works in the same way.
Cool.
Yeah, excellent. Well, this was just a short one to kind of go through that stuff. So I think that was really useful, and I really appreciate that. So thank you very much, Morgan. And we'll see you on the next video.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks.
See you on the next one.
Cheers.